Good morning. Today we look at Job 34 and 35, and this Elihu is still speaking, as he does for a few more chapters, but he says, "Hear my words, you wise men," and a little sarcastic indication here, I think, when he's talking to these three friends. Give ear to me, you who have knowledge, and then, verse 5, he starts to plead Job's case. He says, "For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. Why should I lie concerning my right?" And so this Elihu has been hearing what Job has said, and then he starts to talk about God. In verse 10, far be it from God to do wickedness. Can God do wickedness? This God who is love, this God who is full of grace and mercy. Is God the one that's going to do wickedness? He says, far from the Almighty that he would be able to commit iniquity. He repays man according to their work and makes a man find a reward according to his ways. But verse 12 again, surely God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice. God it's just, it's that thought, that God inflicts this stuff upon people. And Elihu is saying, no, God is not able to do that. This just goes against who God is. And I think about, if the world were perfect and there was no sin in the world, and we were all good people the way we were meant to be, there was no evil in us. Everything would be so much better, and we know that. And we wouldn't be able to hurt each other. We wouldn't say bad things about each other. We wouldn't, do an awful lot of what happens in the world today the way it is. But since evil is in the world, that happens, but it doesn't happen from God. This is Elihu's position. When he says again, I'm going to read verse 12, God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice. And then he says in verse 14, if God should set his heart upon it, if he would gather to himself his spirit and his breath, if he was to take back the life that he's given to human being, all humanity would die. And it's so he's saying that it is because of God that we live. It is because of God that we have our breath and our living and our understanding and all of those things. And then he seems to address Job more personally, more individually, starting in verse 16. And he asks some questions. Should one who hates justice govern? And I think that's a great question for today as well. Should somebody that is prejudiced in the way of justice between people, but should someone who doesn't want to see the justice govern? Should we have people in our offices and our of power and position and making laws? Should we have people that are over controlling or controlling those things like that don't care about justice? This is what we are to do. It's like Jesus' parable of the unjust judge. Why would we have a judge who is unjust? They are to be impartial. They are to look at things, from both sides and determine the guilt and the right, and so why would we want to have someone who is unjust govern? And he's asking that of Job, pointing it out to these other three, that why would we want to have a God who is unjust? And he says, God shows no impartiality. You commented on that yesterday, and Paul wrote that as well, as I mentioned yesterday too. I understand that God shows no partiality, and maybe that was Peter said that, but they both most likely did. But will you condemn him who is most just? Will you condemn God? How could we condemn God? It just doesn't make sense. He's not partial to princes. He doesn't regard the rich more than the poor, for they are all work of his hands. That just a reminder that each and every one of us is a child of God. And then verse 21, for God's eyes are always on the way of man, and he sees the steps. There is no darkness or shadow of death where the workers may hide themselves. He does not need to consider a man. There, and it's just, again, that, God knows who we are. We don't need to plead our case before God, because even before we do, God knows who we are. And he just, kind of talking a little bit more, it seems, straight to Job, but within the hearing of these other three as well, of course. And then in chapter 5, Elihu talks about self-righteousness and condemns that. We can't make ourselves righteous. We are only made righteous because of God. And he says, he has that question in verse 2, do you think that do you say my righteousness is more than God's? Do we think we're perfect? I mean, of course we don't. I mean, we know we are sinners, but then again, Job was professing his innocence, but and Elihu says to these other, look at Job, look at who he is, and look at all of the people that respect him, look at what he's done and everything, rather than try to nitpick and everything that way. Elihu says in verse 6 of chapter 5, if you sin, what do you accomplish against him? If your transgressions are multiplied, what did you do to him, God? If you are righteous, what does that matter? And what does he receive? What does God receive from you? Your wickedness affects people, and your righteousness is for God. And so this Elihu isn't seeming to point out or try to point out fault and everything that way. He's looking at things in many ways with the eyes of justice. He's not condemning Job. He's not exactly lifting him up as a perfect person either, but he's looking at both sides of the story here. And he says, in verse 10 of chapter 35, one says, where is God my maker? Who teaches us more than the beasts, and who makes us wiser than the birds of heaven? We cry out, and he does not answer, because of the pride of evil men. Surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Almighty regard it. And and he says, and now because he is not punished in his anger. God is not punished in his anger. So again, I think Elihu is kind of pointing out that, God isn't punishing Job, that, God doesn't do the harm. And it's, that question, why do bad things happen to good people? And it isn't from God, and it isn't, people will ask, well, why did God let this happen to me? And it's, God isn't inflicting hurt and pain and those things on anybody, but those things happen because of the sin of the world, because of the ways of the world, and nobody's life is perfect. I mean, God doesn't take everything away, that would cause us to stumble. Life goes on as it goes on, yet God is there with us and in us and around us and beside us in all of those things. And as I read this story of Job too, I always think about, what's God thinking as he's seeing what's going on. And we're going to find out here in a few days too, that a little bit more about that. But when we don't think very often, I don't imagine of how what we do might have, I don't know, it doesn't affect God, but how much of what we do is God aware of. And if we thought about that a little bit more, how much better a person we might be.